Hello, everybody. Quickly before we go into questions, I wanted to just give an overview of some of the things that have been discussed related to the security assignment. So the goal of this assignment was to try to create an assignment that looks something like real-world security auditing, which is hard to do and make the assignment tractable. But a lot of times in security, the hard part is actually knowing that there's a flaw there and finding it. If you can find it, often these things are pretty easy to fix. So for example, in early versions of Android, there was a root attack that the flaw stemmed from in the zygote. When they forked a process, they forgot to check the return code from forking the process and then setting the user ID associated with that process. So there was a way that you could exploit that in the fact that they didn't check the return code to cause them to fork a process as root that was running your app. So with this assignment, the quiz is probably the hardest part of this assignment, where you have to go and actually discover and find what are all the security flaws. And then the second part, fixing them, is probably pretty easy once you know what the flaws are. You should then be able to pretty quickly go and see what needs to be changed in the code to fix them. One of the things you should think about when you're looking at what is and isn't a flaw is, in my lectures, I talked about some things that were better ways of designing abstractions, and that's not necessarily going to create a flaw. If someone is using an integer, for example, that won't necessarily create a flaw, but if it gets used incorrectly, then it is going to create a flaw in the security. So another thing is, people pointed out and said, well, this app is storing passwords in plain text. Isn't that a bad idea? And it's a terrible idea. You don't want to do that. But the idea was to create something that was clearly sensitive that is being stolen by the checker app. So the flaw in this case that you're looking for is, what are the things that that app is doing that are making it directly possible for the checker app to steal the login information from the iRemember app, or be able to go and record sound through the iRemember app, or be able to get location through the iRemember app. So those are the things you're looking for, is what is allowing that other app to get access to those things. If those mistakes weren't there and they were storing plain text passwords, but they were doing some things right that the iRemember app wouldn't be able to get access to, or the checker app wouldn't be able to get access to the iRemember information, the checker app would just be blocked by the underlying Android platform's security mechanisms. But if somebody had access to the device, they could always go and look at the actual data stored on disk. But we're not looking for that. We're really looking for the attacks that are enabled that allow another app to get access to information from iRemember. The final thing to note is that there was an update after the assignment was released. Android released an update to the SDK tools. So SDK tools 23 was released, and it has some bugs in it that have been reported to Google and accepted. And one of the bugs is that it breaks the Android 4.0 AVD. So you can't run a 4.0 emulator if you upgrade to SDK tools 23. So for this assignment, you have two options. If you haven't upgraded, and my recommendation is that you don't upgrade to SDK tools 23 until Google fixes some of the bugs in it. But if you have already upgraded, then what you can do is you can actually do the entire assignment with an Android 4.3 emulator. So the only thing that you can't do with an Android 4.3 emulator is see the location stealing demonstrated. And seeing it demonstrated won't actually help you find where the bug is. So you can look at the app and run all of the other checks for sound and for login stealing on a 4.3 emulator, but you just can't see the location stealing demonstrated, because that issue was patched after Android 4.0. So if you have already upgraded, you can complete the assignment and fix the various bugs on an Android 4.3 emulator without having 4.0. You just won't be able to see the location location stealing ability demonstrated, and so that's the main downside of that. So let's see. Someone.
When you're done, you can click on done.
Okay.
Yeah, you can click you can put it. It'll put it up there in the top part.
Yep.
Yeah, and then you can answer it.
Sheila mentions that 23B makes it possible to use 4.0 again. I haven't tried it yet, but if that's true, that sounds great. I'll definitely go and test that before I post anything to make sure. But if you've had experience with it and it works, that's fantastic. So I'll go and test 23B if that's been released and see if it fixes things. Okay, Sheila also asks, I did manage to plug the 2 holes that we were supposed to plug, but the quiz eludes me with 49 points. Yes, the finding the flaws is the hardest part of this, and it's 6 points per question, so that indicates that you've got 1 question wrong. So you've either checked something that shouldn't be checked in one of the 9 questions, or you have not checked something that needs to be checked in one of the 9 questions for that last one. And yes, we certainly recognize that this is the hard part of trying to find and differentiate, what are the true vulnerabilities, and going through the code is certainly hard. Someone posted, okay, Ian posted that if you install Eclipse, then install Android, the SDK tools version 23, that the 4.0 AVD is okay. So that's good to know. So if you don't already have Eclipse installed and do the update mechanism, then and instead you install Eclipse and then install SDK tools 23, everything will work. So that's some great information to have. I'll also try that in addition to 23B, which apparently has been released, and post the results so that everybody can use that. But I know that several people have mentioned that they were able to either downgrade or reinstall Eclipse from scratch. So Ian, I appreciate that feedback. That's very helpful to know that you can use that ordering to get it to work. Derek says that he was able to use Genymotion running Froyo API 10 to complete the assignment, so that's also good to know. We didn't. We tested on Genymotion with 4.3 just to make sure. Once we saw that SDK tools 23 had some issues, if you upgraded, we tested on Genymotion 4.3. But that's helpful to know as well, that you can use Genymotion with API 10. Dina Carr mentions that Android L is listed in the build path. Yeah, I haven't experimented with Android L at all, but I would be interested to see how it works from a security perspective when some of the changes that they've made. I've heard a variety of different things that are being updated, and I'll be curious to see if they made it in and how they affect overall security on Android. Okay, well, great. If there are no more questions, I'll turn it over to Doug. If not, I am in the process of updating and getting the lectures to be released for the next course in the sequence, the Cloud Services course. And so within a week or so, you should be able to go and preview all of the lectures for the course, as well as the assignments should come out in a week or so, and the code example should be available. And just as a reminder, originally we were going to run this as a 6 weeks course, but some people had concerns about being able to complete the material in 6 weeks because of it being the summer, so we decided to extend the timeline to be 10 weeks, but the core required material is 6 weeks long. And so you can complete that material at any time during the 10 weeks to give you flexibility around vacations and other things. But we will have a full 10 weeks worth of material if you want to go and dive deeper in cloud services and various topics. So we'll have the core 6 weeks worth of required topics and assignments, and then we'll have lots of additional material on a variety of topics, ranging from patterns to build high performance applications under the hood. And these are the patterns that are used in things like Nginx and Jetty and various frameworks. as well as deeper into going and deploying things to the cloud. We actually had a question today about adding material on Docker, the container framework, and I'll try to get some Docker material integrated into the course as well. We've got a couple more questions that just showed up here. First question is, how many security holes in week 7, assignment 6? So there were 5 key issues that we were looking for you to identify and fix. Let's see here. Is it a good idea to revert back to the older version of the SDK? If you've already updated and you don't want to revert back, you can complete the assignment without reverting back. Again, you just won't be able to see the proof of concept of stealing location, and we wanted to give people that sort of aha moment of seeing another app exploit and steal information from the I Remember app. You won't be able to see it steal the location information, but seeing it steal the location information doesn't actually help you find that vulnerability. And for the second part, which is fixing, you don't need to fix the location vulnerability. So it shouldn't affect you if you've already upgraded and you're using SDK Tools 23 for the fix-it part. But if you do want to downgrade, you can to see that proof of concept, although several other people posted some great things about other versions of the AVDs that you can use on Genymotion or other approaches to getting SDK Tools 23 installed to make them work. So before I tried to downgrade or do one of those, I would probably follow up on one of those approaches that people mentioned a minute ago and see if they work for you. So Andre asks, you know, a lot of apps ask for a lot of permissions. Should you avoid them and consider them malware? And this is one of the challenges of the Android model, is that yes, you know, Android requires apps to go and ask for all the permissions of the things that they want to do, but it's hard to know if the app is going to use all of those permissions in a legitimate way, or if it's going to use them to do something malicious to you. And the shortest answer is it's really hard to know. I mean, if you trust the developer, then maybe you should trust the app and the permissions it's asking for. If there's a mismatch between the permissions that it's asking for and your expectations for that app, then I would definitely think carefully about whether or not to install it. So for example, if you're installing a wallpaper app and it asks for permissions to control Bluetooth and Wi-Fi on your device, then I would definitely think that that's a mismatch between what it's asking for permission to do and what the app is supposed to, you know, actually supposed to do. And so if you see a clear mismatch, then I would definitely not install the app. If you get it from the Google Play Store, hopefully their bouncer and checking has, you know, vetted it to some degree, but it's still very hard for them to know for sure certain that the app is not malicious. Another thing is if you have an app that, you know, asks for a lot of permissions, it's also going to be a higher security risk just in general on your device, because if they haven't properly protected all of those permissions that they're getting access to, they might allow other apps to, you know, do privilege escalations through that app. So, you know, more permissions in an app, especially if it doesn't really need all of the permissions it's asking for, could be either an indication of malware, or it could be an indication of an app that's getting more permissions than it really needs, and so sort of adding potential security vulnerabilities on the device through privilege escalations or other types of attacks. But overall, it's very, very hard to know definitively if an app is malicious or not. Even if you took an app and you decompiled it and looked at all the code, it could still be really hard to figure out if it's you know, a malicious app. You know, Google works really hard to vet the Play Store. Apple obviously works really hard to vet the App Store. And so, you know, at least relying on them as a first line of defense is helpful. If you don't install, you know, apps that aren't from the App Store, you know, if you only go through the Google Play Store, that's probably going to give you a better chance at getting a legitimate app than if you go and install random things that you download, or you go and get from a third-party app store that may not be as rigorous in reviewing the apps. There's a question: is it do you have to add permissions or change exported to solve the assignment, there are a bunch of different ways that you could potentially fix the bugs. When you have an activity and you don't list the exported attribute on that activity in the manifest, then the default, if the activity has no intent filters, is to make it not exported. If the activity does have intent filters, then the default becomes to export it. So it's one of those tricky things where if you don't explicitly provide a value for exported, Android will provide a default value for you, but the default value completely changes based on whether or not you have intent filters. So it's always a good idea to provide either an explicit value for exported, or in cases where you have an activity that has access or uses some permissions that are sensitive, to always think about whether or not you should also require callers to have the same permissions that you're using. And there's multiple ways to do that, from declaring your own permission to just requiring an existing permission be used. So Derek asks, is it possible, because there's this intent filter for time zone change and it's not really being used, is it okay to remove it? You can certainly remove it, and that will probably change the behavior and security of the app. And that's fine too. At the end of the day, the goal is to fix the vulnerability. There are pluses and minuses to different ways of fixing it. Some other developer might come along and change intent filters on an activity and suddenly cause a security vulnerability because it's not clear what's happening. You could go and have an activity that didn't have any intent filters, add some, and then suddenly introduce a security vulnerability because it changes the default value for exported. So there's lots of ways that you could fix this. Some of them are probably going to be preferable to others, but all of them would be counted correct if they fix the flaw in this particular assignment. And so if you want to remove something that isn't really needed and shouldn't really be there, that's perfectly fine. So you can remove anything you want from Android Manifest that is not needed and will not break the functionality of the app, or remove anything from the login activity that shouldn't really cause any problems for anything else in the app. So there's a question, what is the weight of the quiz as opposed to peer review in the assignment? Because of the way that the Coursera platform is set up, we have to factor those grades in separately. So the quiz grade goes into the grades of the normal quizzes that you create, and then the peer assessment part goes in as an assignment. So they'll be factored into each of those scores respectively. Okay. We have a question from Jet. It seems that requiring any permission can thwart a malware application if that malware doesn't have that permission. Is that considered a correct solution? Yeah, it's certainly fine to use to introduce new permissions to prevent other applications from getting access to activities in your application inside of iRemember. So requiring that callers have permissions, particularly permissions that you are using to do something in an activity, is certainly a good practice, particularly if you have an activity that is exported and could be called by another app. So requiring permissions is a very good idea, and certainly a valid solution to some of the security flaws that we see, is to add permissions that should be there. Jed also asks, I'm amazed that you can decompile an Android APK so easily. Doesn't this make stealing code a bit easy? So it is actually really easy, yes, as you've seen, to decompile an APK. Yes, you could steal code, but there are obfuscation mechanisms available. So ProGuard is one of them, and what they'll do is they'll take all of the things that won't break the app. If there's a public interface that the app, an activity has to conform to, or a certain naming convention for method, it can't change that. But these mechanisms for obfuscating the code will basically go and rename all of the methods and all the variables into things that are very nonsensical, like A1, A2, A3. And so when you start looking at code that's obfuscated, that has, lots of methods named A1 through 100 and lots of variables named B1 through 100, then even though you can decompile them and get access to the code, it becomes hard to do anything useful with it. If the code isn't obfuscated, then it's pretty easy to steal the code. But from a security point of view, it's also a good motivation for why you should never take something that's your private developer data and embed it into your app. So if you take something like your access keys for Amazon's AWS, their web services, and you take your private key and embed it into the app, then it's very easy for someone to reverse engineer the app or decompile it in order to extract your private key and start using it to spin up services in Amazon that you're getting charged for. So because it is so easy to decompile these things, you have to be very careful about what data you do put into them. And that's why it's any app that you deploy to a end user's device is considered insecure. And if you look at things like the OAuth 2.0 specification, one of the things that they say, for example, is if you are doing like a password grant flow where you're trying to request a token, well, in that particular flow is the idea that a client could authenticate itself as well as the user authenticating in that flow. But if you are deploying to a end user's mobile device, the client really can't authenticate itself because it can't keep a client secret because the end user could decompile the app and steal it. So it's very easy to extract information from these apps.
I'll mention Gmail and Google Maps as two good examples of heavily obfuscated apps. If you look at the code, it makes no sense whatsoever. Yeah,
so Doug just pointed out that if you try to look at the code for Gmail or Google Maps, that they are heavily obfuscated. So Google is employing heavy obfuscation to protect all of their intellectual property in Gmail and the other Google-provided apps. Dell asks a great question. He says, as a developer, shouldn't we be minimizing permission requirements? It seems too many developers throw in every possible request for permissions just to be sure they aren't all necessary. That's absolutely true. Your app should not ask for a single permission that it does not need. And if there's any way that you can reduce the number of permissions in your app, it's a very good idea to do that. The Android model really isn't at its best when all of the apps are asking for lots of permissions. The simple way that apps could make or developers could make their lives easy is just to always include every possible permission in their manifest. But if we all did that in our apps, then Android would be highly insecure because every app would have essentially the equivalent of every, almost like the system's same permissions as the system has. Not quite the same, but almost the same. And yeah, you're absolutely right. App developers should really do their best to figure out what they actually need and only keep those permissions. Certainly one way to do that is to add all the permissions that you think you need in, and then one by one you could comment them out and see if your app breaks, although that's not the easiest thing to do. In general, you should, as you're using features of the API, look and maybe you should always start with no permissions. As you use features of the API, if you encounter bugs, then look and see if it's permission related and add the appropriate permission that you need. Is it possible for app to steal log data of another application or program? And as we saw in the links in the assignment description, on certain versions of Android, they used to allow arbitrary third-party apps to get access to all of the logs on the data on the device. And so on certain versions of Android, it is possible to steal logs. I believe the permission was taken away from third-party apps in Android 4.1, but on other earlier apps, it is possible to steal log data. Yep, Jet mentions that we should make sure and refresh before closing just to make sure there are no more questions, so we'll do that. Which Spring framework will be used during the cloud course. So if you're talking about which of the specific frameworks within, or the sub-projects within the Spring framework, we're going to be using Spring Boot, dependency injection, Spring Data REST, Spring Security, Spring Web. We're going to be using Spring OAuth 2, and all of it's going to be built with Spring Boot as the driver. So if you built Spring apps in the past and hated all of the XML that was required, or hated the huge amount of configuration you had to do, Spring Boot is amazing. They have just vastly simplified using Spring to build web applications. So that's why we're going to be building on top of Spring Boot, is it just vastly simplifies and accelerates the creation of cloud services or web-based services for mobile devices. So we'll be using all of those. We'll also use some other open source libraries like the Retrofit library, which is provided by Square. We'll also be using, I'm trying to think of some of the other ones, Jackson, which does automatic mapping of objects to XML. And then we'll use some of the other projects in Spring to connect to various databases and cloud services. So things like Spring Data MongoDB to connect to a Mongo database, the Spring Data Amazon DynamoDB connector. We'll also look at some of the things to convert a project into an App Engine project so you can run it on App Engine. And then we'll possibly look at Docker and some of these other tools. Stefania asks, I haven't really understood from the questions in the forum if add permission and exported are both possible solutions. If you have an activity that is being called by another, or that is callable by another activity, there's multiple ways to prevent that. One of them is not exporting it. You could certainly do that, and that would prevent an activity from being called from an external app, and that would solve a problem if you were leaking data or causing a privilege escalation. You could also add a permission so that the caller had to have equivalent permissions, and that would also solve an issue of a privilege escalation. So both of those approaches are ways that you could prevent one activity from being used to perform a privilege escalation attack. Neil asks, what stops bad-intentioned people from posting a supposedly legitimate app which asks for a lot of permissions, then posting another app that uses permission escalation to hack your phone? That is absolutely a possibility. These are called, the right term for it, but basically it's apps that are colluding against you. So you can have, basically take something that seems really malicious because it asks for a lot of permissions. You can create, multiple separate apps, let's say 3 separate apps, and you can either give them the same, you can either expose those permissions through, channels where you can do permission escalation. So that's certainly a possibility, and there's nothing that can easily stop that from happening. It's also possible that you can have malware that asks for a lot of permissions, but it doesn't have any code directly in the initial app that you download that exploits those permissions in some bad way. And then after you install it, it downloads off the internet the actual attack payload that leverages those permissions and does something bad. But it's very difficult. I mean, I think the best analogy is if you're installing an app on your device, it's the equivalent of handing your device to that app's developer. So when you accept the permissions, if you accept that it can track your location and that it can get access to the internet, it's the equivalent of handing your phone to that app's developer and saying, here, take my phone, you can check anything you want on the internet, and you can get the location of this app or of my phone anytime you want. And that's sort of the mentality you have to use when you're installing apps, and realizing sort of the ramifications of it is you have to say, is this a developer that I really trust to hand my phone to? I trust if I went to Google I.O. that I could hand my phone to a Google employee, and they're probably not going to do anything bad with it. I hope not. But if I'm walking down the street and some guy says, hand me your phone, and I want to be able to track your location at any time, I'm probably going to be a little more skeptical. And unfortunately, that's the reality, is that we just have to make best judgments, because when we're installing code on our phone, there's always the possibility that it could get permissions if we give them access to them and do something malicious with them. How can we expect clients and customers and users of Android to make informed decisions about what apps to allow or disallow? So there's a lot of answers to this question depending on the organization. Some organizations say, well, you're going to use a separate phone for all of your work-related communications, in which case we will specifically tell you which apps you are and aren't allowed to install, and we'll enforce it using some mobile device management solution. So that's one approach, is to just say, you can do whatever you want on your personal device, but we're going to give you a separate device for work stuff, and on that device we are only going to allow very specific apps because we want to limit our security risk. Another approach that gets used is to try to use this idea of a container, where you have corporate apps that run in some application layer container, and then the idea is that app or the set of apps that are running that application layer container won't be easily exploited by the other apps, because they're running in this special container that makes sure that they encrypt all of their data and other things. That sort of protects things, but you could still have people root a device or install a container on a rooted device, and maybe the container doesn't know that, although most of the containers try to check for rooted devices. Now, so one of the interesting things is Android L is supposedly incorporating a lot of the capabilities from Samsung's Knox platform, which includes some of the SE Android security controls into Knox, and so it's supposedly going to have containers so that you can have the idea of like a secure persona. So you have separate sort of secure areas of the Android device, to where by apps in one area can't get access to any of the apps in the secure area. And so it'll be interesting to see from a security perspective what is actually in Android L, and if these things will solve a lot of issues with respect to installing apps and stealing corporate data. From the user side, you're still stuck with the same thing. You still have to somehow make a reasonable judgment about what should or shouldn't be installed. I mean, one approach is to try to figure out apps that you absolutely trust and just install those apps and create whitelists of apps. The other is to try to have a ever-expanding blacklist of apps that you shouldn't install, but then you're always a bit behind and maybe really far behind on what you should and shouldn't install. So it's a really hard problem. The sort of the simplest approach is to try to just have very, very few apps that you whitelist and allow onto devices, and to be very careful about that vetting process. Is it possible in Android to restrict or change an app's permissions once installed? So there was a setting that was added, and I can't remember which version of Android, but they added a settings screen to allow you to turn on and off individual permissions for apps, and then they removed that. And there's lots of speculation on why they removed that capability after making it available, and why it didn't go into general release as a main part of Android. From the underlying technical, how Android is built, it's certainly possible that Android could give you a screen to where you could go and undo permissions that you've given to individual apps. But Android doesn't give you that capability out of the box, and some security enhancements for Android and some of the phones that get sold for privacy give you that capability to go and undo permissions that you've given to particular apps. Some people have even built systems to where you can feed an app dummy data. So you can give it permissions, for example, to check your location, and then you can say, I want to feed it a fake location, for example, because if you take away a permission that an app really needs, then more than likely it's going to break and not be runnable. But if you feed it fake data, then it should be able to keep operating. So there's various approaches, but none of them have really made it into the mainstream of Android and been released in the main devices produced by the big OEMs. But it certainly seems like it would be something that would make sense to incorporate into the core of Android. Does Google have any tools to look at and identify malware in apps before you install them? So yes, Google, if you get apps from the Play Store, Google vets all of the apps and supposedly has various checking tools that analyze the binaries for all the apps that are submitted and looks for things that it thinks are malware and suspicious. It's not 100% clear what the techniques are that they're using. I'm assuming it's probably a combination of signature analysis and looking for apps that use certain capabilities which are probably suspicious, things like loading bytecode that's downloaded remotely. But yes, Google does do a lot of vetting of the apps that come in and try to identify malicious apps, although whenever a new attack comes out, if it's not widely known or understood, it's always possible to evade the malicious app scanner that Google is using. And then in more recent versions of Android, there's actually an attempt to scan the apps on your device once you install them to try to find malware. And I think all of these approaches are probably good for finding well-known malware, but if it's something that's really new and has just come out and hasn't affected a lot of people, then my guess is that their scanning techniques and won't be that effective. Will we be using Amazon S3 for any of the projects in the cloud course? So there will be optional material that you can do on how to connect and store data in S3 and interoperate with it from a service that you write, or a HTTP-based service that you write. And if you want to go and actually, and we have example code for uploading videos to a service and storing them in S3 and using some of their functionality like pre-signed URLs to allow clients to directly send data to S3 without having to get access to your security credentials. So some of those topics will be covered in the cloud course, as well as Amazon connecting to Amazon's DynamoDB, which is a really interesting key value store database. So those topics will be covered. They won't be required, and you won't be services sign up for them. And you want to actually deploy this code and interoperate with, Amazon S3. There will be instructions on how to do it and video content on doing it, as well as example code that you can set up and connect to those things. There's a question about permission. Write external storage is never a good idea and uses permission, then malware can easily change data. Yeah, this is kind of an interesting point. I mean, again, it depends on what the malware, what you're storing. If you're storing photos from the camera, it probably doesn't matter so much. Although in 4.4 and above, you can't just have free reign over the SD card. So a lot of these issues with external storage will probably be fixed going forward once most of the devices make it to Android 4.4. But as an app developer, if you're trying to support anything before 4.4, you still have to be cognizant of what you save to external storage could be exploited. But after 4.4, you can't have free reign over the external storage. So you can probably be a little bit more generous in what you store there. I would still, if it's something really private, not store it on external storage. But if you see an app that is something that has sensitive, or going to collect sensitive data from you, and it has write external storage, you might want to look at what files it's actually writing to make sure that it's not taking any sensitive data from you and accidentally exposing it to the SD card. Where did you find the data that 14% of Android devices are using SDK above 4? Yes, that is an incorrect statistic that was quoted in the assignment description and will be updated. Yes, it's much, much higher than that. Most devices, I believe, now are on 4.0. I think it's like 14% or 4.0 or below. So it's actually more of the opposite of what's there. So we're actually going to fix that, and I'll see where Mitchell got that from. But yes, that was absolutely a mistake that we had there. Where should we keep users' login and password if not on the web? So if you are trying to store, well, and this is really, where should you store users' login information? So it kind of depends on what you're trying to do. If you're trying to have you know, an app that is auto logging into a service, you know, preferably you would use something like OAuth, you know, OAuth 2.0, to where you would, you know, do an OAuth password or do an OAuth flow to get a token that you then store that token and protect that token in order to gain access to the user's account. So that would be much preferable to storing username and password. And those tokens, there's some nice properties of them. One is that, you know, if the user decides they want to deauthorize that app, they can deauthorize it without having to go and change their, you know, password or trying to change something in their account. It's easier for them to deauthorize individual apps. If one app is compromised, it doesn't compromise the user's password itself, it just compromises that token, which can be revoked. So using something like OAuth would be a much better way to do it. If you are really having to store passwords for some reason, it would be much better to store them on some server somewhere, you know, properly hashed and protected, and just use that server as a proxy to get access to some resource that needs a username and password from that user. But in general, you should only be storing, you know, really only storing on a server usernames and passwords that are for your service that you built. You really don't want to create an app that, for example, has somebody enter in their Google credentials for, you know, Gmail, let's say, and then store that on your own server so that you can easily get access to their Gmail somewhere else. You really want to go through an OAuth-like flow to get a token and get access to things. That's a much better way to do it. From a securities perspective, you know, what are the implications of running an app off the SD card? So I haven't looked in detail at what the security controls are on running an app off the SD card. I'm hoping that they enforce permissions in terms of they don't allow arbitrary apps to overwrite APKs on the SD card. Now, if that's not the case, if you can just overwrite app data on the SD card like the APK, then it would be highly insecure, because you could go and take an arbitrary APK that had been installed on the SD card and modify it to do really terrible things. So you could modify its logic to do anything. I haven't looked into, and I have to, you know, I confess I haven't looked into detail on running apps off the SD card, but I'll try to follow up on that and then post in the forum what I find. But my guess is that they provide controls to make sure that the APKs and other things for that app are protected and aren't just, you know, world readable. Samsung installs apps on your behalf and doesn't allow the owner to uninstall the apps. What do you think of that practice? I really don't like the practice of installing an app on something that I'm buying that I can't then control to some degree. You know, I also, from a security perspective, a lot of the really bad vulnerabilities have come from apps that OEMs have provided that weren't properly protecting permissions or properly protecting access to resources that they had. So there have been a whole host of you know, issues with OEM-built apps. Some of the really bad ones were apps that were logging all kinds of data from your location to browsing history, things like that, and then allowing other apps to get access to that information with no permissions whatsoever, just through a flaw where they were leaving like sockets open that could be connected to by another app, or, you know, weren't adding appropriate permissions or saving things with the wrong file permissions. All of the same mistakes that you see, you know, all other app developers make, have been made in OEM apps probably at one time or another. So, if there's an app that I really don't need or want on my device, I would really like to be able to remove it, and I don't like the idea that I can't do that, particularly when OEMs haven't had a perfect track record by any means in terms of security in their apps as well. But that's a great question. How do you write OAuth? It's OAuth, O-A-U-T-H. So Omega, Alpha, User, Tango, Hotel. So O-A-U-T-H is the way that that's spelled. For the assignment, we have to consult 2 websites. The one regarding the stealing of log data is okay, but the other one is not easily accessible. Yes, that the which is kind of funny. The NIST vulnerability database went down, which would be interesting to know if it was attacked for some reason. But it was down. It was back up when I checked it this morning. But both of them are reporting on the same type of vulnerability with log data. So if you have one, you should be okay. But both of them are reporting the same thing. It's basically apps that were logging information that was sensitive to the Android log, and then that information was being stolen. So, but I can try to find another link to another relevant app that was being exploited through its log data and post that. But both of them are regarding the same type of vulnerability. Okay. Given that what you write to your apps memory is secure, is storing passwords locally really such a huge issue? What are the exposures? So it depends on how you look at it. Now, if you're writing into memory, that's probably a lot of less of an issue. It's if we're talking about memory, that's one thing. If you're talking about storing on the SD card or onto the actual file system, the persistent storage, you don't really want to do it for a couple of reasons. One is if you lost your device and somebody got access to it, and you didn't properly and thoroughly protect those usernames and passwords, then it would be possible to crack and extract them from the device. And even if you hash or do other things, a lot of times the techniques that get used on mobile devices, because users don't want to enter in long PIN numbers or things, it's easier to sort of crack and extract usernames and passwords from a device. So as long as you are in physical possession of your device, it's unlikely that anything bad would happen. It's unlikely that another app is going to get root access on an Android device and then be able to read your file system data from your app and extract that data. It's more of, if you lost your device, somebody else got access to it, then they could take that data off of your device and do something with it. If they got your username and password, they would know it, versus if you're just storing like a token, they're just getting a token, and it's easy to revoke those tokens without having to go and change your username and password. Should we protect source code in Android apps? Is it a security vulnerability? If you distribute your app, somebody can always decompile it and look at the source code. It can be obfuscated to make it hard to read, but if there's just a specific point that somebody's trying to get past, let's say you have some type of mechanism so that you require people to pay to unlock some capability in your app, and by default you have that capability as part of the code. You just have like an if statement that checks to see if they paid or not. It would be trivial for someone, even with an obfuscated app, to probably find that if statement and change it. Any type of other private data, like I said again earlier, Amazon private developer keys, shouldn't put those into an app. In fact, if you create an open source app that's on GitHub and that has Amazon's private or Amazon private key in it, Amazon has a scanner that's scanning GitHub continually, and they will email you and tell you. So it's absolutely, you shouldn't view anything that you put from a source code perspective into your app as necessarily private. It might be hard to figure it out from a really large scale perspective. Like, if somebody tried to take your obfuscated code and then write another app and maintain it and evolve it over time, they're probably going to have a lot of trouble doing that, because it's just going to be so hard to evolve and maintain your code over time. But you shouldn't view that if you have really a secret formula, it's going to be hard to protect it in your code, because they can be decompiled and figured out. Is there a way to audit the security of third-party apps? Yes and no. It's a hard problem. If we could audit them perfectly, and we could take an arbitrary app and know if it was malicious or not, or had any security flaws or not, then Google could employ that in like the Google Play Store, and we would all be in much better shape. It's hard to know definitively if an app is secure or not. So, for example, an app might have some conditional logic in it that was only executed in a very rare circumstance that's hard to trigger. But under that rare circumstance, the app is highly insecure and might save data somewhere that leaks your username and password or your contacts or something else. And it's just really hard to go and, in general, take an arbitrary app and know for certain whether or not it's secure or not. Some people have mentioned things that you could look at and evaluate. One is, how many permissions is it asking for? Does it really need all the permissions that it's asking for? You could always decompile the app if you're really, really thorough and try to figure out, is it doing anything? Has it been obfuscated? If it hasn't been obfuscated, maybe you could look at the code and see if it's doing anything that you don't like. You could also go and we've done in some of our research in the past where we've run apps, malware in particular, in emulators, and then watched how they behaved and what APIs they interacted with and what network traffic they were sending out, and try to identify issues that way. But it's in general a hard problem and not a solved one by any means. Will we be able to see our quiz attempts during the evaluation period? Yeah, I am not certain about how this works, but we're going to figure it out with Coursera on getting back to the previous attempts. I know several people have posted about that, and the solution that people have found and listed is that they can go back in their history and see the attempts, but we'll try to find out if there's a way to enable that with Coursera. Which OAuth 2 flows will we be using in the cloud course? Well, in the examples that we're going to be doing, we're going to be developing both our own app, so our own client, and we'll be developing the service. So we'll go through the password grant in the code examples. However, we'll discuss some of the other flows in some detail, although we won't have example code for them, so we won't go into as much detail. If there are specific flows that people would like to see discussed, if you want to post on the forums, I'll look for those and try to make sure that those get incorporated. Or if you have example code that you would like to see for a particular type of flow, let me know and I'll see if I've got something that I can provide in the cloud course. And also during the cloud course, if people have specific things that they're looking for, feel free to post those, and I'll try to either find resources or post example code, or if I can get the time and find a way to fit it in, add video too. Do you think it is important to modularize Android development? I think writing modular and extensible code is really important. There's a lot of Android tools that I use all the time, and I think are really helpful tools for writing sort of more modular and extensible Android code. One of those that I love is Butterknife. I actually wrote my own version that did something similar to this years ago, before Butterknife was out and widely available. But these tools give you a lot of ways of automatically, for example, connecting your views and click handlers to the to your code and your activities and your fragments and these types of things. And so there's a lot of great frameworks out there, particularly with respect to HTTP communication, things like Retrofit that give you type-safe invocation of HTTP-based services. There's dependency injection frameworks like Google Juice that can be used in Android. I think Spring even has an Android version that can do dependency injection. A lot of those things can help with modularity as well. Someone asked, can we not just delete SDK 23 if we have already upgraded? There are some detailed descriptions of how to downgrade if you've already upgraded in the forums. One solution also that's been posted is that you can always just install Eclipse from scratch and then install SDK 23 and everything should work, not going through an upgrade patch or path. I haven't done that yet, but so those are a couple approaches.